The following lecture wouldn't exist without the generous sharing of insights and sources by Dr. Mark Allen Wright. Though the finished product is mine, I couldn't have made it without some very important insights which he has graciously shared with me through personal communication. The following video was made with his blessing, though I take full credit for any and all errors. I haven't read his unpublished manuscript, and he hasn't seen the video. Also, this video is a condensed version of a much larger paper, so check the link in the description for a more detailed version of what you see here with longer, more detailed quotes and a bibliography. The first person to connect the Book of Mormon to Mesoamerica and Mesoamerican calendar systems was Charles Anthon, an American classical scholar who inspected the transcript of Nephite characters shown to him by Martin Harris. In a letter from Charles Anthon responding to E.D. Howe, written in February 17, 1834, he describes the content of the characters thusly, quote, "It consisted of all kinds of crooked characters disposed in columns, and had evidently been prepared by some person who had before him at the time a book containing various alphabets. Greek and Hebrew letters, crosses and flourishes, Roman letters inverted or placed sideways, were arranged in perpendicular columns, and the whole ended in a rude delineation of a circle divided into various compartments, decked with various strange marks, and evidently copied after the Mexican calendar given by Humboldt, but copied in such a way as not to betray the source whence it was derived." End of quote. Though attempting to discredit the Book of Mormon, Charles Anthon unwittingly gives us a tantalizing clue regarding the Book of Mormon in both time and place. Though the Aztecs and their calendar post-date the Nephites by hundreds of years, both the Aztec and much older Mayan calendrical systems simultaneously used a 360 plus 5-day year, paired with a concurrent 260-day year. These two counts were used simultaneously. Aside from different terminology due to speaking different languages, the only difference between the Aztec and Mayan calendars was that the Mayan calendar system also used the long count, an additional introductory count of 360-day years, counted in sets of 20 and 2020s, the Katun and Baktun. Mormon and Moroni, though prophets, were men of their time and place. Like all men, the metaphysics, epistemology, and worldview of the dominant culture naturally became their own and influenced them in ways that they may not have been aware of. As ancient Mesoamericans of the classic period, the Mayan calendar and its attendant metaphysics of cyclical time and predictably symmetric history influenced the structure of the Book of Mormon and provided a paradigm through which God could interact with his children in their weakness after the manner of their language that they may come to understanding. Now, a handful of Latter-day Saints have picked up on the Book of Mormon's own cyclical view of history, which, as we shall see, echoes that of the Maya. First, on Saturday the 15th, President Heber C. Kimball, while at the Endowment House, prophesied that when the final last struggle came to this nation, it would be at the Hill Cumorah, where both of the former nations were destroyed. Another one, as I stood upon the summit of the Hill Cumorah, here a people perished because of their extreme wickedness. There is something in the destiny of things that would cause a repetition of this terrible scene on the same spot many centuries later. I reflected and wondered if this unhappy time would ever come when another still mightier people will incur the wrath of God because of wickedness and likewise perish. If so, would this same spot witness their destruction? And finally, two great American Christian civilizations, the Jaredites and the Nephites, were swept off this land because they did not serve the God of the land, who is Jesus Christ. What will become of our nation? In her book, The Indian Christ, the Indian King, the historical substrate of Mayan myth and ritual, Victoria R. Bricker has noted the following regarding the Mesoamerican cyclical view of time in the context of the Mayan short count. Quote, "The Maya believed that history was repetitive, that the events in one cycle would be repeated in all successive cycles as they had been repeating since time immemorial. Therefore, the calendar could be used to predict events in the future, i.e. in succeeding cycles, and the people had no control over their fate." End of quote. While the short count postdates the Book of Mormon by hundreds of years, the cyclical view of history existed in the classic when Mormon lived. As we shall see in the examples of Copan, Palenque, and Yaxchilan, the 400-year Baktun for the ancient Maya was the basic bundle or cycle of history. On Copan's altar Q, the horizontal top features a large inscription. Surrounding its 4 vertical sides are the 16 kings of Copan. The kings are depicted sitting on their name glyphs. Since there are 16 kings, there are 4 kings on each of the 4 vertical sides. The inscription on the altar describes the lineage founder Yash Kukmo becoming a divine king somewhere outside of Copan, almost certainly Teotihuacan. He arrived at Copan wielding the Coil scepter and became a divine king of Copan. On one of the vertical side panels, Yash Pasach, the king who commissioned the altar, is depicted as receiving Kahuil from Yash Kukmo himself, becoming the divine king of Copan. On a monument commemorating the ascension of Yash Pasach, almost all of the text describes the ascension of the lineage founder Yash Kukmo. What's more, Yash Kukmo's handing over the Kahuil scepter to Yash Pasach encloses the alpha and omega of a dynasty spanning 16 generations. Yash Pasach doesn't receive the Kahuil scepter from his own father, the last king, but from his illustrious ancestor Yash Kukmo, who arrived in Copan only 9 tun before the auspicious beginning of a new Baktun, 90000 or 435 AD. Yash Pasach becomes king in 9, 16, 12, 5, 17, only 4 tun before the next Baktun, 100000. David Stewart describes the neat bundling of time in Altar Q in the following way. I know of no other monument like Altar Q, with its visual representation of collapsed history. Its message of a royal gathering or meeting spans nearly 4 centuries of kingship. In other words, 95% of the entire span of the Baktun from 90000 to 100000 neatly encompasses Copan's ruling dynasty. The final 5% represents a lack of any evidence whatsoever. This correspondence between the beginning and ending of the Baktun with the rise and fall of Copan's rulers is striking and very unlikely to be coincidental. End of quote. Keep the above in mind as you read what David Stewart says about the kings of Palenque. Quote, Palenque's later kings, it seems, deliberately chose to fold time back on itself and repeat the sequence of the kings who came before them, with some other names intervening, for history is seldom so cleanly structured. We have the pattern 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Again, I have to scratch my head and ask, were the Maya consciously portraying their dynasties as closed systems of some sort with beginnings and endings and following an internal symmetry? End of quote. At Palenque, the reign of Kukbalam I started at 431 AD, and the reign of Kinich Kukbalam II started at 764 AD. 337 tun, that's 3 katun and 3 tun short of a baktun. Like Copan, Palenque has one more poorly attested king before both sites collapse in early 800 AD. What's more, a similar roughly 400 tun pattern appears at Yaxchilan, with the last 3 kings, which fall outside of the chiastic pattern, echoing the 2nd, 3rd, and 6th kings. It appears that in Copan, Palenque, and Yaxchilan, that as the 400-year cycle or bundle which hosted these dynasties was coming to end, the people perceived these dynasties and the resultant social order that they presided over as necessarily coming to an end, thus precipitating a collapse that was already on its way from drought and war. Here's more David Stewart on the whole cyclical history as prophecy phenomena. Quote, the classic Maya must have been very conscious of the way the approaching end of the Baktun seemed to coincide with profound societal pressures and logistical difficulties, and perhaps to some the coming of a new era was a way to understand and account for them. Once time has explanatory power, it can take on a life of its own, and self-fulfilling prophecies can't be too far behind. No matter how we eventually come to account for the end of the classic Maya civilization in the 9th century, it seems that the vast long count calendar played a role in politics and religion. It seems to me it probably is no accident that after the collapse of scores of kingdoms in the 9th century AD, the long count essentially ceased to be a prominent part of ancient Maya cosmology. End of quote. It should be noted that though short-lived, the Nephite royal dynasty at Zarahemla was also chiastic. King Mosiah I, King Benjamin, and King Mosiah II, a cyclical and predictably symmetric view of time, led prophets like Alma and Samuel the Lamanite to predict what would happen on a specific year based on past events for parallel times in a 400-year cycle. Let's look at a calendar prophecy in the Book of Mormon. Quote, "Behold, I perceive that this people, the Nephites, according to the spirit of revelation which is in me, in 400 years from the time that Jesus Christ shall manifest himself unto them, shall dwindle in unbelief. Yea, and then shall they see wars and pestilences, yea, famines and bloodshed, even until the people of Nephi shall become extinct." End of quote. Moroni records this prophecy's fulfillment and does it specifically when addressing the Lamanites of the distant future, presumably because he assumes its fulfillment within the 400-year cycle will mean something to them. In Omni 1, 3-8 and 4th Nephi 1:48, the same date of 320 years is used to record rampant wickedness in the days of Ammoron and Ammoron, despite the two men being separated by almost 600 years. Both stories share the nominally same year, personal names, and rampant wickedness. The first set of dates is counted from the time Lehi left Jerusalem, and the other from the time a celestial sign was given of Christ's birth. In both Jerem 1:5-6 and 4th Nephi 1:2-3, the paraphrased 200 years had passed away marks a period of righteousness, prosperity, and expansion. Again, the first set of dates is counted from the time Lehi left Jerusalem, and the other from the time a celestial sign was given of Christ's birth. Both Alma the Younger and Samuel the Lamanite prophesied that the Lamanites would be destroyed 400 years after the celestial signs are given of Christ's birth, and Moroni notes the prophecy's fulfillment. Because the cyclical nature of history provided a precedent for making such a precise calendar prophecy. If Mosiah II became king at around 124 BC, then factoring in 2 patrilineal generations back, 35 years each, then Mosiah first led his people from the land of Nephi and became king at around 194 BC, about 393 years from when Lehi left Jerusalem. Furthermore, when Zeniff and his people returned to the land of Nephi some 2 generations after their ancestors departed with King Mosiah I, it was inhabited by Lamanites and not Nephites, suggesting that whoever didn't follow Mosiah first was killed off, enslaved, and or assimilated by the Lamanites. In his book, The Lost 116 Pages, Reconstructing the Book of Mormon's Missing Stories, Chapter 12, Don Bradley notes, quote, "An authorial hand appears to be at work in shaping these chronologies to make them so tightly parallel, whether that author is the human author of the text or the divine author of history. One possibility is that in his account of the apex, downturn, and decline of the late Nephite nation in 4th Nephi, Mormon presents these events so as to echo his account of the apex, downturn, and decline of the early Nephite nation, which he had given in the Lost Pages." End of quote. Further evidence of this cyclical view of history in the early classic comes to us from various monuments from the classic period. Again, David Stewart, the pioneering epigrapher and scholar, has done the best work on this, and the following ideas and observations, minus their application to the Book of Mormon, are his. In multiple sites, the Maya view of cyclical history manifests itself in the following pattern. First, one or more events are described as happening in mythic time, the deep past before 13:00:00 for Ahau 8 Kumku, the, quote, first, end quote, day of the Maya calendar. Second, next, more events are sometimes described as happening in what Stewart calls foundational time, the century in which the dynasty was founded, which in the inscriptions is never before the 1st century AD. Finally, an event or events is described in historical time, the relatively recent event that the artisan is commemorating with the stela. Sometimes an additional event is also prophesied to happen in the distant future. The idea being that for the classic Maya, the past repeats in the present, then repeats in the future, in very predictable and symmetrical ways. For them, history is always repeating according to the patterns of their calendar systems. David Stewart has identified several examples of what this looks like. In Palenque Temple Tablet 14, we learn that on 9 Ik 10 Mol, a famous ancestor, later Wuka'an, grasped the Kawil scepter. The reader is then told to count forward about 144,000 years to 9 Ik 10 Mol when Kinich Ka'an Balam grasps the Kawil scepter. In Palenque Temple Tablet 14, we have the Tzolk'in and Hab dates of 9 Ik 10 Mol and 9 Ik 10 Mol, each separated by 144,000 years. But in both cases, it's a date in which a ruler grasps the Kawil scepter, the Maya symbol of rulership. In mythic time, it was Lady Wuka'an. In historical time, it was Kinich Balam. Both events are the same kind of event, separated by time, but happening on the nominally same date. La Corona Panel 1 has a series of half-period commemorations and bannerstone dedications, all happening on 4 Ka'an, 3 different times, 2 in the deep past, 1 in historical time, plus the prognostication of a coming half-period commemoration on 9 Ahau. Deep past, historical time, and the future. The first 3 all happening on 4 Ka'an. From Piedras Negras, Planel 2, we get 2 helmet-grasping events happening in the month of Kech. The first helmet-grasping event happens 140 years later. I'm sorry, let me say that again. From Piedras Negras, Panel 2, we get 2 helmet-grasping events happening in the month of Kech. The third helmet-grasping event happens 140 years later. Finally, we have Naranjo Altar 1, where we have this pattern of events happening in mythic time and foundational time, followed by events in historical time, and a prophetic view towards an event in the future. In his paper, David Stewart uses examples from various Mayan centers to show that this wasn't the idiosyncratic view of one scribe, but a pan-Mayan metaphysic of symmetrical and predictably cyclical history, where history and prophecy are almost synonymous, where the past is the present, is the future, and the future is the present, is the past. The dynamics of mythic time, foundational time, historical time, future time, and the Baktun as an era encapsulating bundle influenced the basic historical structures of the Book of Mormon. Analogous to the Mayan vision of mythic, foundational, historical, and future time, the Book of Mormon has what we might call Jaredite, foundational, historic, and future time. However, the Jaredite history found in the Book of Ether is not the same as mythic time among the Maya. Rather, Jaredite history in the Book of Mormon had the same function as mythic time did in Maya text. It was the precedence upon which the events of foundational time, historical, and future time took place and were given meaning. For Mormon and Moroni, like other classic era Mesoamericans, foundational time for them would be sometime in the 1st century AD. In their case, the birth of Christ and or visitation of Christ, and their analog to mythic time was the Jaredite era. So now we see one reason why Moroni added the Book of Ether to his father's book, and why Mormon added Nephi's small plates to what he had already written. Nephi's small plates contained the more sacred part, prophecies of the distant future, and Moroni's relatively brief synopsis of the Jaredite dynastic history provided the mythic precedent for both the Nephite history and future Gentile history. In his Book of Ether, Moroni takes the time to connect Rama to Cumorah when describing the destructions of two peoples separated by a long period of time. He is connecting the same kind of event happening in the same place in both Jaredite time and historical time. What's more, the Book of Mormon gives us 3 founding boat migrations, 2 in mythic time and 1 in the future: Jaredites, Lehites, and the Gentiles. Secret combinations plague the people in Jaredite time, foundational time, historical time, and the future. Also in the Book of Mormon, the Lord Jesus Christ only seems to speak with his prophets face to face as a man in Jaredite time, foundational time, and in historical time. Moroni in writing Ether 12 alludes to the story of the brother of Jared and his face-to-face encounter with the Lord, and then ends the chapter testifying of his having received the same blessing. 2 of the 3 divine visitations mentioned above happened at sacred mountains or temples. You also have a wholesale destruction of the wicked happening in Jaredite, foundational, and historical times, with the Jaredite downfall, the volcanic destructions which marked the Savior's death, and the Nephite downfall. This cyclical view of history doesn't just apply to events, but to people too, as later Mayan kings are depicted in ways that allow them to imitate their ancestors in similar occasions. For example, on the Palenque Temple 21 bench, Pakal, in a deity impersonation ritual of 2 distant ancestors, Cha ruler and Spine Snake, is depicted with both of their attributes on his headdress. Similarly, in Tikal Stela 16, while officiating in a period-ending rite, Jasa Chan Kawil is depicted as having the attributes of his very distant ancestor, Kaak Chan Ek, who in Dos Pilas panel 18 is depicted as officiating in a period-ending rite in the deep past. The prophet Mormon seems to have done the same thing in describing both himself and the prophet Alma in ways that echo Nephi's description of himself. Regarding past efforts to study the Book of Mormon in light of Maya Calendrics, Neil Rapley has used the ambiguity between the Hob and Long count to show how Samuel the Lamanite's calendar prophecy and the confusion as to when it should be fulfilled might have been a confusion between rather Samuel the Lamanite's prediction of what would happen at the end of 5 years was counted in 360-day Tun versus 365-day Hob. Both sets of years were called Hob by the Maya, the nomenclature of Tun and Hob being a modern convenience. The confusion apparently warranted the Nephites being given a 25-day grace period for the prophecy to be fulfilled or face extermination. John L. Sorensen has pointed out that the Gospel of Matthew places the birth of Jesus during the reign of King Herod. King Herod died in 4 BC, which means Jesus, assuming Matthew is right, was born sometime before 4 BC. However, the Book of Mormon says that Jesus was born 600 years after Lehi left Jerusalem at the commencement of the first year of Zedekiah's reign. The first year of Zedekiah's reign was in 597 BC. If we count 600 years as being 600 Tun, then the Book of Mormon puts Jesus' birth at around 5 BC, an acceptable year for anyone seeking harmony between Matthew and Mormon. John L. Sorensen was also the first to explain how in Alma 51, 33 through 37, and Alma 52, 1 through 2, Teancum's killing of Amalekiah was a form of psychological warfare. Teancum killed the Lamanite king on the last day of the Wayeb, which would explain the frightful Lamanite reaction as the last 5 days of the 360 plus 5-day year were considered unlucky. Instead of celebrating the new year, merrymaking, and performing its attendant rites on the first day of the new year, the king was dead. In 66 BC, the first day of the year was one Pop, and it fell on August 21st. This would explain the description of the night preceding Amalickiah's killing on New Year's Eve, Zero Pop, the seating of Pop, in Alma 51:33. The day's heat would have been the heat of summer. Quote, and it came to pass that when the night had come, Teancum and his servants stole forth and went out by night, and went into the camp of Amalickiah, and behold, sleep had overpowered them because of their much fatigue, which was caused by the labors and heat of the day. End of quote. And now for some words of caution. First, in no way should this lecture be seen as a call to esotericism. The last thing I want is for even one person to take up the Mayan calendar and the Book of Mormon in order to predict the future and start a cult of preparation based on such folly. Mormon and Moroni came from a completely different world, the world being that place and time in which what we think, do, and say makes sense. Their worldview and metaphysics in both time and history makes sense in the Mayan world, but not the world of the modern reader. Thus, any attempt by modern readers to divine the future by using the Book of Mormon and the Mayan calendar might be ineffective at best and dangerous at worst. We live in a different world. We think in different ways. Second, we don't know exactly what the internal calendar of the Book of Mormon looks like, but it almost certainly isn't the Mayan calendar. Just as American Jews, Chinese, and Persians might celebrate the New Year on January 1st, plus Rosh Hashanah, Chinese New Year, and Nowruz, the first being the date acknowledged by America's majority culture, and the latter being examples of ethno-religious particularity, the Maya calendar would have been to the Nephite prophet historians what the Gregorian calendar would be to the modern American Jew, Chinese, or Persian. As a superminority within Mesoamerica, the host civilization's religion, worldview, and metaphysics would naturally have bled into that of the Nephites and Lamanites, especially during the times in which they neglected the religious tradition of the Nephite prophet historians, which was often. Finally, there is also no reason to suggest that Mormon and Moroni fabricated history to match the expectation of cyclical time. Mormon and Moroni recorded what was important to them. Understanding the Maya calendar and its attendant metaphysics of symmetric history and cyclical time helps us see why much of what they wrote was important to them and the people they wrote about. Thank you.